Welcome to this fourth webinar of the series Women's Ideas in the History of Medicine, which is jointly sponsored by the Center for the Study of Medicine and the Body in the Renaissance, CSMBR, and the Center for the Study of Women Philosophers and Scientists at Paderborn University. I'm Fabrizio Bigotti, Director of the CSMBR, and along with Dr. Gilles Muller, I'm the co-organizer of this event. Today, I'm happy to introduce the webinar Seasonality and Slaughter, Sourcing Animal Ingredients in 17th Century Household Medicine. Today, I would like to remind everyone to silence themselves to allow the smoothest interaction online. If you wish to interact with the panel, please make sure to check the position of the button, raise your hand in the lower Zoom ribbon, and you will allow to make yourself known. Without further ado, I'm very glad to introduce our keynote speaker today, Madeleine Sheahan. Madeleine is a PhD student in the history of science and medicine at Yale University and Santorio Global Fellow at the University of Parma. Her research examines the social history of female healthcare and the variability of local medical marketplaces in 16th and 17th century Italy. She's particularly interested in the relationship between midwifery and pharmacology, with a focus on the therapeutic activities of lay women who operated on the periphery of conventional academic, monastic, and guild settings. Madeleine, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Can I go ahead and share my screen?
Indeed, you can.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so very much for that introduction. I really am so excited to be here. Can everyone hear me all right? Is the setup working just well? Okay, wonderful. I want to just jump right into it and start us off by thinking here about time, and by thinking critically about the many ways that time and temporality on varying scales collided in the making of medicines in the early modern household. Even the simplest domestic medicine required really some level of forward thinking in gathering seasonally available ingredients, in preserving those ingredients, in laboring to produce those medicines over a period of time, sometimes for days, sometimes even weeks, and preparing stocks of medicines to meet the household's medical needs throughout the entire year. Medicines really were rarely just produced on demand, and instead follow a production cycle that matched the workflow of the household itself and the natural environment. Hold on. There we go. So it matched the natural environment and the household workflow. And I have an image here that captures many of these themes as it sort of transports its viewers to this abundant scene of harvest in the allegory of summer. And it depicts this beautiful woman, this goddess of fertility, at the center, surrounded by peasants dutifully sort of engaged in agricultural labor as they reap nature's bounty. The household and surrounding landscape that unfolds behind emphasizes the connection between dwelling and the natural environment, detailing the ways that country living and seasonal cycles unfold in tandem. So then turning our attention beyond this imagined scene to the very real household estates of 17th century England, seasonal provisioning characterized much of early modern household management and medical care. Domestic recipe books, which are really the central primary source I'll be talking about today, are filled with these kinds of descriptions. Recent scholarship in the history of medicine and the history of science has really worked to expand historians' understanding of the use and the practice of specifically plant materials in this kind of capacity, in this seasonal provisioning. Particularly in connection with early modern fields of inquiry, such as the herbal tradition, botany, and natural history. However, animal-derived ingredients have somewhat faded to the background, and the specifics of their use and value has been somewhat lost or generalized. My talk today recenters animal ingredients as an important, albeit smaller proportion of recipe ingredients and places them in the context of seasonal household provisioning within elite aristocratic households. I also situate the use of animals and their bodies within the varied epistemic practices of recipes to document the specific ways that procuring, processing, and using animal bodies created unique conditions to generate natural knowledge within the 17th century English home. Certainly, the staggering number and variety of animal ingredients recorded in recipes across Europe attest to the believed healing virtues of bodily matter. These writings are filled with graphic descriptions of procuring, producing, and using animal materials towards the aim of preserving human life. Considering how, when, and why these resources informed the material practice of domestic medicine offers a fuller picture of what actually happened in the household, complicating our understanding of what resources were available and what practices were normalized in the domestic provisioning of medical care. Now, women constitute particularly visible practitioners of domestic medicine, as their many medical activities and ideas are documented with an impressive corpus of surviving manuscript recipe books. My talk today offers a really broad survey of these kinds of sources, predominantly authored by aristocratic women, seeking first to place them in conversation with one another, as well as to contextualize them within a broader recipe tradition that, of course, also included collaborations with a diverse group of historical actors in the household. And this does include men in their capacity as family, friends, and neighbors, as well as household servants or outdoor laborers. So in terms of structure, I'm going to start with an overview of issues in animal procurement and in methods of preservation before turning to a couple more in-depth case studies of specific recipes, including recipes for oil of swallows and for a mole powder. And we'll kind of investigate these and what they mean shortly. But really to start then is with a question of provisioning and how provisioning relates to seasonal change. And certainly in botanical preparations, stocks of common ingredients like herbs and flowers were accessible based on their seasonal availability, whether purchased from an apothecary or grocer or self-grown and or harvested. The time of year not only dictated availability, but also underpinned conceptions of a material's efficacy and potency. Domestic recipes that assumed household production articulated the best time to harvest ingredients, noting when their medical qualities were at their strongest. Scanning through various recipe collections, you will find commonly reiterated statements outlining the temporal scope of recipe work. For instance, this 17th century manuscript recipe book from the Lovell family instructs on how to, quote, know the time of virtue in herbs, throughout the year knowing when they are at their strongest. More commonly still were products like May butter or March beer, which, as these names suggest, maintain designated production times in certain months. Now, domestic practitioners similarly followed sample patterns of seasonal work in harvesting and processing animal-based ingredients for their recipes. While it would have been entirely possible for householders to purchase preserved animal specimens from retailers, fresh animal ingredients were assumed to be collected from the household's own holding or from neighboring natural areas, as evidenced by the fact that most recipes included instructions on how and when to kill the animal. As we see here in this image, we have an abundant household estate from which a huge variety of live animals have been caught or hunted, ready for their processing. What's presumed then is that these animals in question are to be found and kept alive until that very moment of processing. Just like plant harvesting, these practical limitations restrained the procurement of live animals to particular times and to particular natural ecologies. Spring especially remained one of the most demanding periods of medical provisioning, both in providing new, fresh ingredients and as this important liminal boundary between winter and the incoming year. Now, for instance, Lady Joanna St. John's recipe book contains a remedy for a cough syrup to be made then. And the recipe instructs, quote, at the month of May, take 6, 8, or more little white snails that have no shell. Take them alive in a spoonful of new milk and a great pint of it after every morning." End quote. Provisioning in this recipe made use of young snails more visibly available in the month of May, at a time when warming temperatures would have stimulated the insects hatching after their winter hibernation. That they be taken alive is a critical component that limits the time scale of the recipe to this particular month, when presumably the household kitchen garden is riddled with these kinds of insects. As another example, the Lovell family collection contains a recipe for a stone in the kidney and instructs the reader as follows, quote, "Take a right hedge sparrow, kill him, pull him, and split him, and take out the guts. Then salt it very well on both sides and let it lie 12 hours. Then in the morning, strip off all the flesh and divide it into 2 lumps. Eat one fasting in the morning and the other at night. Do this 2 days in April and so at Michaelmas." What is prescribed here in this recipe is somewhat of an odd cure of salted sparrow meat to be given 2 days twice a year, once during April and once during September, that being the month of Michaelmas. The recipe notably aligns with important periods of seasonal change at either the beginning of spring or the beginning of autumn, providing a cyclical dose of the remedy as an extended regimen, as this kind of health maintenance. I would suggest then that this recipe aims to provide continued treatment at 2 periods of the year that might threaten the patient's body, autumn and spring, when the changing heavens were widely understood to impact human health. I would also stress that this recipe implies the procurement of a fresh sparrow from nature, directly from nature, assumed to be readily available and easily secured. As we'll see with further examples, these features in terms of seasonal availability and cosmic time begin to elucidate how and why certain resources were or were not implemented in household medical practice based on the time of year and also the sort of qualities of the ingredient. Now then, having looked at some of these examples, we can turn to a couple more concrete cases. And by turning into these case studies, I want to consider how the seasonal making of medicines is not only a response to just limited availability, but is also an expression of a particular preference based on ideas of efficacy and vitality. This is because the emphasis placed on the seasonal procurement of animal ingredients relates to a pervasive interest in not only sourcing live animals, but in using animals of a young age. Like Joanna St. John's implicit call to use nude or juvenile snails, recipe writers regularly asserted a temporal component at the intersection of seasonality and animal age. Recipe books are filled with these kinds of references, calling for ingredients such as young pullets, capons, chickens, cows, sheep, as well as listing a host of wild species to also be used at a young age. One of perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities is the somewhat infamous puppy water. And recipes for the puppy water, such as that of Mary Doggett, which has been examined by historian Lisa Smith, called to distill the fat of a live puppy in a still, then to be made into a facial treatment or a cream of some kind. Now, if the terminology puppy rather than dog wasn't enough to emphasize the animal's desired age, additional age markers appear in contemporary written recipes for the puppy water, such as young, fresh, newborn, or even more specific notes such as 2 to 3 days old. The puppy water as a cosmetic centers the preservation of youth as a substantial concern in recipes that achieve supposedly age-defying results through the reprocessing of young bodies. The quality of youth is important in this respect, as the distillation process seemingly transfers the puppy's youthful body to the user's skin. Now, more generally, puppies themselves were also listed in contemporary pharmacopoeia across Europe, such as the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis by Nicholas Culpeper and also the Ricettario Fiorentino. In professional pharmacy, animal fat was a discrete category of materia medica to be preferably collected from young, fat, healthy animals at the sort of peak plumpness of their juvenile age. Puppies as an ingredient, too, were mentioned in other recipes, For instance, in a recipe for an agwe, which offered direction to, quote, take a live young puppy and lay him on your flanked stomach half an hour before your cold fit, and let him go cold there until you're hot filled also. He will become sick and you well. The puppy in this case is presumed to sympathetically cure the patient through contact, absorbing the illness into its own young body. Now, beyond the case of puppies, the pervasive desire for young animal bodies is reiterated throughout recipe collections using common language that described animal age in terms of their growth and development. Especially notable is the way that birds feature in these recipes, that there is a strong desire for birds of a very young age. As an example, the recipe book of Constance Hall, first begun in 1672, offered this kind of note in a recipe for the falling sickness, writing, quote, take young ravens when they are ready to feed, bake them with brown bread till they are powder, mix it with honey till it is an electuary, end quote. Unlike adult ravens, the birds that Constance Hall calls for are, quote, ready to feed, meeting in a state of early adolescence. Despite being presumably less available than their adult counterparts, these juvenile birds are the recipe's primary medical ingredient. Hall omits pieces of critical information, for instance, whether these ravens can be caught wild or available domestically. Nonetheless, this is not a recipe that makes use of simply available young birds. It explicitly calls for them. It would have been easier to source adult birds, but this recipe specifically is asking for the young. The directive to source birds at this life stage highlights the fact that recipe writers, like Constance Hall, were not only concerned with procuring live animals, but particularly sought to direct users on procuring a specific kind of ingredient based on its age. Another recipe, too, from Constance Hall for a consumption calls for the gallbladder of a, quote, sucking pig, for the same reason, for this desired vitality of a younger animal. Using developmental markers like ready to feed or sucking offered a useful guideline for determining age and more generally suggests practitioners' knowledge of animals. For instance, sourcing a wild bird might require practitioners to have some familiarity with its physical characteristics through its growth, as well as to understand general patterns of activity, as well as to understand its home within the local ecology. Even employing a professional bird catcher, as pictured here, kind of called for a level of natural knowledge even at the managerial position. Sourcing domestic animals, likewise, could be used as an opportunity to better understand the animal's breeding patterns, their life cycles. And we know women engaged with this kind of knowledge making because they work to produce and share recipes for animal husbandry and veterinary medicine, including recipes on how to breed birds, for instance. In this way, medical recipes that made use of animals further helped to encourage a naturalistic study of animals, as well as to usefully apply that knowledge to the medical labors of the households. Now, of course, as I've said, spring was really one of the most plentiful seasons from which to harvest young and juvenile animals. In this painting here, entitled Spring, you have a visual representation of bird catching during the season as these amorous ladies sit amongst the forest waiting for men to catch them songbirds. Now, despite these kinds of meanings, we understand for our purposes that this kind of activity is both an aristocratic pleasure as well as a necessary exertion in order to hunt the needed provisions for domestic medicine. This seasonal inflection in procuring birds was also repeated in a recipe for the water of swallows. A reiteration of the recipe in the Lovell family book similarly called for young birds taken directly from nature at a particular point in their development. It recommends, quote, to take 20 or 50 swallows when they be but ready to fly, end quote. It further instructs the reader to bruise them in a mortar, distill them with castoreum, vinegar, and rose water. After listing a number of ailments the water will treat, the recipe concludes with an uncommon description of how to preserve a partial stock of swallows. Quote, if you cannot commonly got so many swallows at once, it is prescribed then, take such as you have got, kill them and set them into an oven on a sieve after bread is drawn, and half dry them. Thus, you may keep them 4 or 5 days and then mix them with others as soon as you can get more. About midsummer is best to make this. These directions reveal a couple of important features in the making of medicines, particularly on the practical limitations of collecting and using live ingredients. The claim that it is best to make the recipe about midsummer out of swallows ready to fly once again clearly establishes this desire for young animals and demonstrates the seasonal availability of these young birds, which usually mate and reproduce about 2 to 3 times between May and September. However, rather than simply presuming an indefinitely large quantity of some live 50 swallows, the recipe allows for a thrifty management of resources and time through strategic animal hunting and preservation. In this case, by catching the birds over a period of a few days and preserving their bodies in a process of slow baking. Joanna St. John's recipe to cure impaired vision provides an alternative preservation technique to keep the bodily materials of swallows fresh, calling to take the young swallows out of their nest and mix them with honey. The recipe further instructs to, quote, pull off their heads, let the blood drop into the honey till it be very red with blood, end quote, and concludes by asserting that the mixture will keep for up to 7 years. In this case, the mixture of honey would presumably have worked to conserve and preserve that fresh drained blood, offering an alternatively sort of simple and thrifty practice to aid in resource management. Still, dehydration remained one of the most popular techniques of preserving animal flesh, which, unlike plant ingredients, required more immediate treatment to prevent spoiling. On drying out dismembered animal parts, a recipe from the book of Elizabeth Freet describes how to dry tongues, writing, quote, salt your tongues with your beef when it be beef before 9 or 10 days. Then take them up and roll them over with some saltpeter and let them lie for 3 or 4 days. Then hang them up for a week where smoke may come to them. Then take them down and hang them up on the outside of the chimney, or if dry enough, in the kicking near the chimney on a rack till you use them. Another recipe on how to rehydrate these kinds of preserved parts also describes how you might use an object like a dried tongue. And it instructs the reader to, quote, take a fox's tongue now killed or a dried old one, slice it and dip it in vinegar to soften. If it be hard, we might then imagine how these ingredients filled the kitchen. We might then imagine how these ingredients filled the kitchens, storerooms, and cabinets of early modern English houses as animal parts in various states of preservation and storage were held for future use. This sits in contrast actually to these idealized scenes of plentiful kitchens, like the still life pictured here, brimming with fresh caught, unspoiled meat, fish, fruit, and vegetables. Seasonality, convenience, and resource management instead collided in practical kitchen work, requiring active methods of preservation to extend the longevity of ingredients and help overcome issues of availability when sourcing live animals from nature. From a perspective of textual analysis and book history, we understand that these kinds of detailed instructions on preservation are also a purposeful reiteration of the author's own knowledge and firsthand experience. Although it's very unlikely that the author of this recipe physically caught the swallows by their own hand, the construction of the text reminds the reader that the recipe itself has been tested and augmented with missing information by experimenting with methods of preservation. This works to validate the recipe writer's firsthand experience and spares the reader the trouble of attempting their own trial. Now, bringing many of these themes that I've already discussed to the fore is another really interesting case. And it's a case of the mole powder, a remedy that was commonly used to treat diseases of fits, known by terms such as convulsions, seizures, the falling sickness, the mother's sickness, or simply epilepsy. The procurement of live moles for the powder was necessary, and it manifested too not only in the hunt for young animals, as we've already seen, but specifically for unborn ones as well. 2 recipes for convulsion fits from the Lowndes family recipe books prescribe a mole powder to be made at explicit times of year due to the breeding patterns of the mole itself. The first recipe is a, quote, mole powder for convulsion fits to be made only in March and September. Take the moles alive, cut their throats, making them bleed as much as you can upon a pewter plate or dish. When they have done bleeding, rip up their bellies and take out their guts, lungs, and young ones, blood and all. Lay them on the pewter dish and set them to a warm oven after the bread to dry gently, for if it scorches or burns, they are quite spoiled. Turn them often till they are perfectly dry, blood and all, so that they may be beaten to a very fine powder. Then paper them up and keep them in a dry place for your use. Beat them to powder as you use, sifting it through a fine lawn sieve. A dead mole is good for nothing. You must cut the throat alive. Although nearly identical, a second recipe makes the reasoning behind the seasonal procurement explicit, writing, quote, take the moles alive in March, the only month that is fit being they are with young. Cut their throats while alive, let them bleed into a pewter dish, and when they have done bleeding, rip up their belly, take out the large young ones, blood, guts, and all, and set them into a warm oven after bread to gently dry. As the second version makes clear, the efficacy of the recipe relies on the mole being pregnant. The author Gervase Markham, in his printed household guide, The English Housewife, suggests a similar mole powder for the falling evil by taking a mole in March or April, specifically when they mate, implicitly reiterating this assumption that a greater efficacy can be found in pregnant moles. More explicitly, the manuscript recipe directs the reader to kill and butcher the animal, removing apologies.
What seems to be the problem, Madeleine?
Sorry. This manuscript recipe directs the readers to kill and butcher the animal, removing the internal organs, the blood, and the young ones, that is the mole fetus in utero. By extension, the recipe, of course, is also calling for exclusively female moles late in their pregnancy, carrying not only a fetus, but one developmentally old enough to be described as, quote, a large young one. Without these key features, the mole is stated to be worthless, to be unfit for the purpose of this recipe, meaning that it's the fetus itself that was perceived by early modern practitioners to hold the recipe's therapeutic value. Additionally, the kind of butchery work called for in the recipe in dissecting the dead mole required precise and practiced skill in animal slaughter and a certain familiarity with animal anatomy. To be able to identify the different anatomical parts of the mole, their lungs, their intestines, the womb, and indeed their young, is yet another realm of knowledge tacitly assumed by recipe writers. For instance, another cure too for consumption fits attributed to a Mrs. March in the Temple family recipe book, similarly called for skill in slaughtering 2 batches of moles. The first was to be bled alive and baked, and the second was to be butchered for their skins that would later be applied to the patient's own body. In a period when animal anatomies were an experimental tool to understand the inner workings of both animal and human bodies, these techniques of dissection show an important crossover between spheres of anatomy and the household recipe tradition. While the lady of the house may not have wielded the knife herself, instead outsourcing this dirty work to a domestic servant, it references a realm of natural knowledge about animals, that is their anatomy, their life cycles, ecological environments, that was being transmitted within the sort of 17th century recipe tradition. This knowledge too, of course, was in circulation within works of natural history and printed household management guides. For instance, the naturalist Edward Topsell, in his History of Four-Footed Beasts and Serpents, wrote on the medicines of the mole, describing a roasted mole powder as very good for the king's evil, for fistulas, for swelling, aches, and bruises, as well as for various fits, going so far as to claim that, quote, whoever shall take a mole and hold her in his right hand until she die, shall have such an excellent virtue therein, that he shall ease the pain of a woman's breast only by touching them. Notice the mole here has also been gendered female. Now, Topsell also recommended various methods to catch and kill moles, as they were considered vermin like foxes, mice, and rats. On the mole, various traps were conceived to capitalize on the animal's instinctive behavior. For instance, trapping a female in a half-buried ceramic pot to lure her mate in as well. In the popular household advice book, The Vermin Killer, knowledge of nature too was traded to better catch and kill unwanted pests. Knowing the rhythms of an animal life aided in extermination tactics. For instance, the text notes it is easiest to catch a mole when she is at her most active. Quote, at her accustomed hours, which usually are at springtime from about 6, 8, and 11 in the morning, and in the evening at about 6 or 4 or 7, end quote. The tacit nature of domestic recipes using these animals clearly assumed knowledge of mole catching. For example, a recipe for an egg calls to, quote, take the moles of a now cast molehill. Although sparse in details, the recipe implies that moles and molehills will be readily identified in the immediate household environment and easily cast to secure large quantities of live moles upon demand, particularly in cyclical periods of the animal's activity. Unlike other more elusive animals, like the swallows previously discussed, it seems vermin living near people in household gardens and lands provided increased opportunity to provision medicines in parallel with estate management and agricultural work. The availability of these sources, or these resources in terms of animals, might both be limited to their breeding times, for instance, in spring or summer. However, household work itself facilitated the capture and use of moles. Now, seasonal changes impacted household medical care beyond just the provisioning of juvenile or unborn animal ingredients. The perceived, here is a picture of molebills to give you a sense of what they might have looked like on the household estate. But the perceived environmental subjectivity of the body encouraged practitioners to prepare stocks of medicines for ailments believed to arise from changing climatic and astrological conditions. The ways in which the changing environment threatened the health of the body is also evidenced in the 2 recipes for the mole powder we have previously seen. Both these recipes note the virtues of the mole powder and prescribe it to be used the day before the new moon, the day of the new moon, and 2 days following. The recipes go on to explain that if you fear the fits coming before the new moon, you should take it and use it as a method of prevention. Both recipes conclude also with a similar efficacy statement, asserting that this recipe, quote, has never failed to cure convulsion fits if taken in time, end quote. The enduring association between seizure fits and the lunar cycle underpinned this advice. Fits of various kinds were commonly believed to worsen during the full moon. Diseases of fits were often argued to arise from blockages of humors or an overabundance of blood. Such excessive fluids were especially subject to changes in the lunar cycle, a process of cyclical hemorrhaging Richard Mead likened to a woman's menstrual cycle in his treatise on the power and influence of the sun and the moon on human bodies. These ideas penetrated popular understandings of the disease, not only in manuscript, but in printed recipe books. For instance, in the works of Hannah Woolley, the most popular writer of household literature in the 17th century. In a supplement to the Queen-like Closet, Woolley provides yet another recipe for making use of moles. She directs the reader to, quote, take a live mole and cut the throat of it into a glass of white wine, and presently give it to the party to drink at the new and full of the moon, the day before the new, the day of the new, and the day after, and so at the full, end quote. Combined with the all-important lunar time, the recipe's primary ingredient is the animal's fresh drained blood. The idea of curing like with like is certainly at play, especially given that the mole blood is prescribed to treat what was understood as a disorder of the blood. The works of Hannah Woolley also provide an alternative vantage from which to understand popular conceptions and practices of recipe work. Like the aristocratic family recipes previously discussed, Woolley's version emphatically underscores the necessity of using a live mole. Such killing and processing techniques thus appear as essential and normalized conditions in the provision of medical care. However, in writing for a popular female audience of a middling status, Woolley's readership likely included a group of women who may have undertaken this physical labor by their own hand. This is distinct from the previous recipes we've encountered, which would have been undertaken by householders in a position of management, most likely directing servants in the preparation of these less appealing tasks. Knife work, however, in Woolley's treatise, is an embodied skill of practiced anatomical skill used by women and practitioners themselves across a broad spectrum of household labors. More generally, manuscript and printed recipes answered pressing health concerns raised by everyday men and everyday women who understood seasonal and cosmic changes to have grave impacts on their physical wellness. For example, in an undated, unsigned letter from a young gentleman in the 17th century, this seasonal conception is built upon. He provides this description of the falling sickness here called epilepsy. He writes of having been seized by the disease 2 months prior to early spring. Pondering the trigger for these newfound fits, the gentleman suggests that it may have been his change in lifestyle as he changed from his winter to his spring coat, or it may have been because of drinking more water than usual. These changes coincided with the shifting lunar calendar, since, quote, at about 3 days before the full moon immediately preceding the vernal equinox, he fell into that fit, end quote. It's worth noting that the vernal equinox or the spring equinox would have fallen around March, marking not only a generally important seasonal and environmental change, but specifically coinciding with these temporal directions to procure moles in the month of March. And these ideas of seasonality and the way that they're interwoven together reappear time and time again in these kinds of popular literature and recipe cultures. Now, in closing, I really do want to reiterate that the moments in which these recipes are to be made and administered sit at the intersections of these various temporal lines, in the breeding and birth of animals and their young, as well as in large-scale seasonal changes between the spring and the fall, and in smaller periodical cycles of the heavens changing that was believed to impact human behavior and the body's susceptibility. Seasonality is therefore not just an accidental or an inevitable feature of domestic medical care. Instead, it really is an active feature of provisioning and preservation that works to capitalize on seasonal availability while still looking for a particularly desired object of medical use, that is, young bodies. At the same time, too, it also sought to overcome challenges of a changing environment. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and thank again our co-sponsors for allowing me to speak today.